Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This novel tells the story of a young woman going out to work as a governess in the middle of the 19th century. In many ways it seems like a simple novel and can be read at face value as exactly that, the experiences of a young woman as she emerges into the world, undertaking one of the very few careers open to women at the period, experiencing social relations as an employee. At another level, though, the novel is quite didactic, and it also espouses quite a strong social cause, which is to say the women's rights. The novel is, notwithstanding, semi-autobiographical. Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This novel tells the story of a young woman emerging into the world in the mid-19th century to take up one of the few modes of employment. Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This novel tells the story of a young woman, Agnes Grey, emerging into the world for the first time to take up employment as a governess. The story is set in the mid-19th century, and the life of a governess at this period was arduous, rather thankless, and frequently governesses could be treated in a rather menial and demeaning way. Anne Brontë herself had worked as a governess, and in some respects the novel is semi-autobiographical. It does narrate incidents that occurred in Anne's career as teaching. It also calls upon anecdotes and incidents that occurred in both Charlotte's and Emily's careers of teaching. The novel isn't, though, entirely autobiographical, nor is it an entirely simple story, a quiet romance of a young woman emerging into the world and, meeting a young man and things progressing. It does have a distinctly didactic purpose, and it is also a social cause novel. Undoubtedly, there is some protest being made about the way in which governesses are treated. There's also quite a lot within the novel that appears to discuss appropriate methods of education, appropriate methods of upbringing for children that would be likely to produce well-adjusted, well-balanced, fully functioning adults in the world. Nevertheless, in order to gain some perspective on the novel and to give an entree into the novel, it probably is useful to look at Anne Bronté's biography. And so I'm going to run through an outline of Anne's life. It's by no means a definitive account of her life, just a quick outline to help with perspective on the novel. Anne was born in 1820. Her life was short. She died in 1849, so at only 29 years of age. She was the youngest of 6 children. Only 4 of the children survived into adulthood: Charlotte, Emily, Branwell, and Anne herself. Anne's mother died when Anne was only about a year old, and Anne's care and upbringing was given over to her aunt Elizabeth Branwell, maternal aunt. Elizabeth Branwell was a highly devout Wesleyan Methodist, and Anne imbibed a great deal of this highly committed, very strictly observant form of Christianity. Throughout Anne's life, she would scrupulously examine her conscience against Christian standards. And yeah, it was a significant part of her life, her Christianity. Together with Emily, in her young years, Anne wrote Angria and Gondal, stories about fictional kingdoms. More than likely, Anne was drawn into this activity by Emily. It did tend to be that Anne followed the actions of her older sisters. The family could be a little bit disparaging about Anne and a little bit belittling. This was probably simply due to the fact that she was the youngest child, so she wasn't as advanced as the others. She didn't know as much as the others. But I think it's just a typical situation for a youngest child. In 1836, Anne went to Roe Head School. Anne really embraced going away to boarding school, unlike Emily, who really had the opposite reaction. She delighted to follow in the footsteps of her older sisters. At this point, though, in Anne's life, she did suffer a crisis of faith, which, against the very committed type of religion that she'd been brought up in, was probably quite distressing and quite traumatic. Also at this time, Charlotte was teaching at Roe Head School. There doesn't appear to have been a great deal of contact between the 2 sisters, and whether Charlotte knew or not about Anne's crisis of faith is quite debatable. Anne made the observation, Charlotte made the observation about Anne at this period that she was naturally sensitive, reserved, and dejected. So it would appear that even if Charlotte was not engaged with Anne's crisis of faith, it was observable on the outside. By 1839, Anne had returned home to the family parsonage of Haworth. Family finances were not good, and in April 1839, Anne decided to go out to work as a governess. Initially, she went to a family called Ingham, who lived at a place called Blake Hall. This was a very difficult post for Anne. It was her first teaching post, and she found the children difficult to manage. Charlotte, in a letter to a friend, describes Anne's experience of the children. She says that they were desperate little dunces. The worst of it is that the little monkeys are excessively indulged. Anne continued to struggle with the children, and already by Christmas the Ingham family let Anne go because they did not feel that she was controlling the children adequately. Nothing daunted, Anne went out a second time as a governess in 1840, so by this time she was aged 20. This time she went to the Robinson family in Thorpe Park in Yorkshire. This was a family of the landed gentry, and for that level of society they were very wealthy and lived quite a grand lifestyle. They had a large house, stables, carriages, etc. In 1843, Branwell came to join Anne working for the Robinson family. He came as tutor to the son of the family. Unfortunately, an accusation of inappropriate behaviour towards the wife of the family was levelled at Branwell. He was dismissed, and Emily followed him back to Haworth, I think of her own free will, but probably her position would have been untenable at Thorpe Green after an incident such as that. The family finances were still in bad circumstances, and Charlotte came up with the idea that perhaps the sisters could make money by publishing their poetry. So a number of poems were collected, and indeed they did manage to publish a volume of poetry in 1846. Reviews were good, reviews were positive. It would have to be said that Charlotte's poetry was much preferred to Anne's, and even Emily's was preferred to Anne's in the critical review of the poetry that we have. Family finances were still in disarray, and Charlotte came up with the idea that the three sisters could make money by publishing their poems. So accordingly, a volume of poetry was collected, and this was published in 1846. The sisters chose to publish under pseudonyms, which are very well known, of course: Ellis, Cura, and Acton Bell, Anne being Acton Bell. Much later on in her life, Charlotte gave an explanation for why the sisters chose to use pseudonyms and why they chose these particular names, which are ambiguous about whether or not the writers are male or female. The ambiguous choices were dictated by a sort of conscientious scruple at assuming Christian names positively masculine. While we did not like to declare ourselves women, because without at that time suspecting that our mode of writing and thinking was not what is called feminine, we had a vague impression that authoresses are liable to be looked on with prejudice. And this probably is accurate. It tended to be that women found it harder to be published than men. And it was also the case that reviews of women's writing could be quite patronising, containing phrases such as the fairer sex, indicating that the themes and topics had been well handled, given the fact that it was the weaker sex that was presenting the content. The same thing happened to artists, women artists. There was also a prejudice against, at this period, women handling certain types of themes. Themes that were regarded as in any way unseemly, as undignified, as inappropriate as well for women. This wasn't just about, this didn't just encompass sexual themes, it could include things to do with violence, domestic abuse, alcoholism. Any such areas, any such topics were not considered appropriate for women to handle and to discuss. So it was limiting on the creative spring, of course, such an injunction, sort of social injunction. The volume of poetry was unsuccessful financially. However, it did receive positive critical reviews. One reviewer said that it was good, wholesome, refreshing, vigorous poetry, written by a family in whom appears to run the instinct of song. With regard to Anne, though, it would have to be observed that it was Charlotte's poetry, Alice's poetry, that received the most critical notice and the most favourable critical notice, and after that Emily's. Anne's poetry was not so highly regarded by this particular reviewer. Buoyed up, though, by the positive critical response to the poetry, Charlotte thought that perhaps the sisters could try their hand at novel writing instead, which tended to be more lucrative. So the three sisters duly sat down and produced 3 novels. And these are the well-known novels of Wuthering Heights, Agnes Grey, and The Professor. So by 1846, these 3 novels were doing the rounds of the publishers in London. Charlotte's hope was that the novels could be published as a 3-decker volume. This was a very popular way of publishing at this period, in which one book contained 3 volumes, and in this case the 3 volumes would each be a separate novel. Interestingly, both Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were accepted for publication, but no publisher could be found for The Professor, although the author, Charlotte, was encouraged to write another book that the publishers would be interested to consider. Charlotte went away and rapidly produced Jane Eyre, and all 3 novels were published in 1847. The 3 novels were very differently received, each from the other. Jane Eyre was immediately a huge success. It sold 2,500 copies in the first 3 months. Of course, it caused a stir in the literary world because of many of the themes it covered. The same was true of Wuthering Heights. It was less popular, but it caused a tremendous stir because of the sensational nature of the subject matter. Agnes Grey, of course, contained subject matter of a much more toned down nature, a much more conventional nature, and as a result was received very differently. It was liked as a novel, however, not many copies sold at all. And despite the fact that, in a sense, it presents life in a way that would have been endorsed by Victorian society, the Victorians did not choose to read it. They chose to read the novels that were much more sensational, that presented life according to what most Victorians would have professed to disapprove of. Eventually, Anne went on, well, not eventually, it was quite shortly afterwards, Anne produced The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which was published in 1848. And this is a much more multi-dimensional novel than Agnes Grey. It is her acknowledged masterpiece, and explores more diversely than Agnes Grey the nature of womanhood and the way in which society chooses to categorise women. It depicts as well alcoholism, corrupt parenting, and marital brutality. So it's really quite an incisive piece of literature. Unfortunately, it was not long after this that the family started to fall ill with tuberculosis. Emily and Branwell succumbed first, and very shortly afterwards, after their deaths, Anne also became consumptive. She had a great love of the town of Scarborough, which is a town on the sea, and she requested to go there. She felt it might help her health. Sadly it didn't, and she died in Scarborough, aged 29, in 1849. The reception of the three novels. Jane Eyre was an instant success. Within the first 3 months of publication, it had sold 2,500 copies. Wuthering Heights also caused a tremendous stir in the literary world. Both of these two novels handled unconventional topics. They had as central themes, really, sexual transgressions for the conventional standards of the period. The handling of these topics was very raw, and as a result, the books were quite shocking and sales were quite high. Agnes Grey is a novel of a very, very different order. It depicts everyday middle-class activities. It tells the story of a young woman pursuing activities which were conventional and acceptable in the real world for a young woman of the period to be undertaking. There is social and sociological discussion of the English class system, of the nature of gentility, of good breeding, of good manners. There is also considerable time given to the nature of education, what is an effective method of education for children. The narrative as well adheres scrupulously to evangelical principles. And there is a sedate romance based on mutual respect and shared Christian values. Despite the concurrence that this novel showed with Victorian moral standards and religious precepts, although it was liked as a novel, just simply didn't sell. No doubt this was disappointing for Anne. Relatively quickly, though, she made a riposte, and in 1848 published The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is Anne's acknowledged masterpiece. This is a multi-dimensional novel, much as Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre are multi-dimensional novels. In fact, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall actually may be more multi-dimensional than either of those two novels. This is, in itself, quite an unconventional novel. It explores the nature of womanhood and also the way in which contemporary society categorised women. And defined their place, defined who they could be and what they could and should be. The novel also grapples with difficult issues. Alcoholism is one, abusive parenting is another, and marital brutality. Gambling also comes into this novel. So, like her sisters really in this novel, Anne proves that she can also produce a groundbreaking novel, a novel which flies outside of conventional standards and which discusses raw issues and perhaps in many ways discusses these issues more solidly, more robustly, with greater realism than issues are actually discussed and handled in either Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. Sadly, much of the creative energy of the family was drawing to a close by this time. Soon after The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was published, Emily and Branwell fell ill with tuberculosis, and they died of this disease very soon after their deaths. Anne also contracted tuberculosis. She loved the town of Scarborough, a beautiful sea town, and felt that it might help her health to go to the sea. And she was taken there, but sadly Anne died in Scarborough in 1849, and she is buried there.